Copper and grit coated her tongue. A steel-toed boot caught her in the ribs, bringing a wet snap that stole all the oxygen from the canyon air. Lyra curled her battered frame into the jagged rock. Above her loomed the camp alpha, stinking of rotted meat and sour wine, casting a long shadow over her bruised skin. Squeezing her eyes shut blocked the sight of the leather whip, but mostly, it hid the curse. Gold swam in her irises. If he saw the sunfire glow, this beating became a public execution. "Get up, mutt," the alpha spat, kicking gravel into her matted hair. She kept her mouth shut, biting down on the inside of her cheek until it bled. Surviving meant becoming dirt. Before the whip could fall again, a low vibration rattled the loose stones beneath her knees. For hours, the camp hounds had been snapping at their iron chains. Then, like a severed nerve, the barking ceased. The wind died. Firewood stopped popping. Ash drifted down through the sudden quiet. Opening one eye, Lyra peered through a cage of tangled hair. The alpha wasn't looking at her anymore. All the blood drained from his face as he stared at the high canyon ridges. Shadows peeled away from the rock face. Dozens of silent wolves stood on the cliffs under the pale moon, perfectly still. Their eyes tracked the camp guards with absolute, predatory focus. Lyra flattened herself into the dirt, listening to the frantic thumping against her own ribcage. Without a single sound, the intruders poured down the canyon walls. They moved like dark water. Teeth flashed. Claws tore into the wardens, ignoring the chained prisoners entirely. The alpha didn't even get a chance to shift. A gray wolf slammed into his chest, ripping him backward in a sudden arc of hot, wet crimson. Blood sprayed across her collarbone. Lyra scrambled backward on her elbows, scraping her skin raw. Standing up in a crossfire meant dying on your feet. Then, the scent hit her. It sliced right through the iron stench of the slaughter. Cedar needles crushed under cold rain. A sharp, feral spice followed it, hooking straight into her gut and pulling hard. Her inner wolf, starved and beaten into submission for years, slammed against her ribs. It wanted to crawl toward the killing floor. She clamped a hand over her mouth to trap a treacherous whine, staring blind into the swirling dust. The sickening crunch of bone and tearing canvas drove her backward, away from the carnage, and toward the narrow canyon exit. Tents collapsed into the dirt as chained prisoners scrambled past her, metal links ringing against the stone. These invaders operated as one lethal unit, silent and efficient, but she knew better than to trust any teeth coated in fresh blood. Captivity taught you to run while the predators were distracted. She dragged herself toward the darkness. Sharp rocks sliced into her bare soles, sending fresh spikes of pain up her trembling legs. Worse than the pain was the scent. That suffocating cedar and rain soaked the air, pressing against her skin like a physical hand on the back of her neck. It fogged her survival instincts. Something hunted her, and it wasn't the pack tearing the camp apart. It was singular, lethal. A rebel wolf hurled a guard into a stack of rotting crates just inches away. Lyra threw her back against the splintered wood and clamped both hands over her mouth. Her lungs screamed for oxygen. The thud of a dying man hitting the ground echoed in her ears, followed by the wet tear of flesh. The rebel didn't spare her a glance, bounding off into the fray. Swallowing the metallic taste in her dry throat, she dropped to all fours and crawled through a rip in the perimeter canvas. Cold wind bit her face. The rocky trail led straight up into the forested mountains. Freedom sat right there, obscured only by silver dust and moonlight. She forced her bleeding feet into a sprint, pushing past the burning agony in her calves. The roar of the nearby river began to drown out the dying screams behind her. Then, the moonlight illuminated the path ahead. Lyra dug her heels into the dirt, skidding to a halt as silver dust bloomed around her knees. A towering figure blocked the only trail leading out of the valley, eating up the moonlight. He wore dark leathers and a thick, fur-lined cloak that snapped in the bitter wind. A curved blade hung from one hand, pointed straight down at the gravel. Lyra stopped breathing. A pale scar cut a jagged path through his left eyebrow and tracked down a sharp cheekbone. Wild, wind-blown hair framed a face built for violence, but his eyes locked her to the dirt. They burned a deep, predatory gold. An alpha who conquered everything he stepped on. He stared directly at her. The cedar and rain hit her face like a physical blow. He was the source. An invisible cord snapped taut between her sternum and his, vibrating with a terrifying primal heat. Her wolf submitted instantly, rolling over in her mind with a pathetic whimper. Lyra stumbled back, hitting a loose stone. Her ankle rolled. She hit the ground hard, a sharp crack of pain shooting through her battered ribs. Scrambling backward on her hands, she tore her fingernails on the rocks. She waited for the blade to rise. She waited for the execution. The steel sword clattered against the stone path. He stepped forward, slow, deliberate, tracking a cornered animal. His chest expanded, pulling in the air between them. When his golden eyes swept over her bruised collarbones and bleeding feet, genuine horror fractured his stoic face. A muscle jumped wildly in his cheek. Before she could blink, he crossed the gap. Lyra threw both arms over her face and curled into a ball, waiting for the final strike. The wind howled through the gorge. Dust pattered against her bare skin. No blow came. Instead, a thick, radiating warmth settled over her shaking shoulders. She lowered her forearms by a fraction of an inch. The alpha knelt in the dirt, right in front of her. He had stripped off his fur cloak and wrapped it around her battered frame. His large hands hovered near her bruised face, fingers curling inward, violently shaking as if he wanted to touch her but feared she would shatter. "Mine," he rasped. The gravelly rumble of his voice vibrated through the stones and rattled her bones. He wore the rebel crest carved into his armor. He tore the camp apart. Yet here he was, kneeling in the dirt, completely paralyzed by the sight of her blood. She stared up into those golden eyes, her pulse thumping wildly in her throat, trapped in the orbit of a monster who refused to strike. His voice scraped through the freezing canyon, rattling the marrow in her ribs. "Mine," ice-coated her lungs. Lyra dragged the fur pelt tighter around her shivering frame, drowning in the scent of crushed cedar and cold rain. Buried deep beneath her ribs, her starved wolf let out a submitting whine. Biting the inside of her cheek brought a copper taste, grounding the panic. She swallowed hard against the acidic bile. A mate meant chains. A mate meant surrendering the tiny scrap of survival she had bled for. Her screaming muscles demanded flight, yet her bare feet stayed glued to the frozen dirt. Before the radiating heat of the alpha could thaw her skin, gravel crunched. Boot heels struck stone, moving fast. A leaner man stepped out from the shadows. Fresh crimson coated his chin, dripping onto leather armor. His cruel eyes locked dead onto Lyra's face. Right over his heart, a crescent moon pierced by a jagged blade was scarred directly into the dark hide. The rebel crest. Bile burned the back of her throat. These were the executioners. The monsters who slaughtered her ancestors and turned the Sunfire Pack into ash. "Kale!" the lieutenant barked, his voice cracking like a whip. "What are you doing playing with a dirty slave? The camp is secured. We need to move." Kyle. The syllables tasted like poison. He was the warlord. Scraping her palms across the ground, Lyra dragged wet mud directly over her eyelids. She rubbed the grit into her skin until it burned. If they saw the golden ring glowing in her irises, she wouldn't just be a slave. She would be a trophy. Silas tracked her movement, flashing blood-stained canines. "Let me rip her throat out. We don't leave witnesses behind." Lyra pressed her spine against the rock face and squeezed her eyes shut. Wind howled through the gorge. Dust pattered against the loose stones. She waited for the teeth. The canyon stones vibrated under a chest-cracking roar. Kale surged upward. He slammed his broad frame between Lyra and the lieutenant, forming an impenetrable wall of dark leather and coiled muscle. "Back away, Silas," Kale ordered. The command hit the air like a physical blow, suffocating and absolute. It drove the oxygen straight out of Lyra's burning lungs. Silas bared his teeth, dropping into a defensive crouch. She is the enemy, Kale. She's human trash. Why are you risking the pack for a broken toy? No explanation followed. The Alpha simply turned, casting his shadow over Lyra's cowering form. His golden irises tracked the wet mud smeared across her face. A consuming fire sparked in his gaze, pinning her to the rock. Then, he reached for her. Calloused fingers gripped her waist. "No, please," she choked out, kicking her bruised feet. He hauled her upward in a single motion. The canyon spun wildly as he threw her over his shoulder. Blood rushed to her head. The intoxicating spice of cedar enveloped her, completely suffocating her panic under a thick blanket of dominant heat. Her treacherous wolf purred, leaning into the warmth of his armor. Lyra dug her cracked fingernails into his back, fighting the unnatural comfort. He was a warlord. He was her ruin. "She is my prisoner," Kale announced. His voice echoed off the cliffs, leaving no space for defiance. "She comes with me." Low growls rippled through the gathered pack, vibrating with absolute hatred. They wanted her dead. Kale ignored the snarling army. His hand clamped down firmly on the back of her thighs, searing her cold skin through the thin fabric of her tunic. He adjusted his grip, digging his boots into the steep incline, and carried her straight into the black mouth of the mountain trail. Freezing wind whipped across the jagged incline, biting savagely into Lyra's exposed legs with every brutal step he took. Kale marched up the treacherous trail for an hour without breaking a sweat. He carried her over his shoulder while his lethal army tracked closely behind. Below his shifting shoulders, the diseased dirt passed in a blur. Twisted roots snaked across the path, pulsing with a sickly glow. The cursed territory was rotting from the inside out, turning ancient bark into crumbling ash. Exhaustion finally crushed her panic. The relentless bouncing drained the last drop of adrenaline from her veins, leaving her completely limp against his leather armor. The dying trees suddenly parted. Stone walls rose from the rocky earth, surrounding dozens of dark tents and fire pits. Wood smoke and roasting meat hit the freezing air, twisting Lyra's empty stomach into a painful knot. Kale bypassed the crowded courtyard. He stalked toward a towering cavern carved directly into the mountain face, guarded by an iron door. Lifting a steel-toed boot, he kicked the metal barrier open. Heat rolled out from a stone hearth. The firelight danced across curved weapons mounted on the rock walls. He stopped dead in the center of the room. Strong hands gripped her waist, hauling her down from his shoulder. Lyra's bare feet slammed into the floorboards. Her bruised knees instantly gave out. Before she hit the ground, Kale caught her. His grip was entirely unyielding, yet shockingly careful. He guided her descent, dropping her onto a sprawling bed of dark pelts. She sank into the luxurious fur. The overwhelming scent of raw cedar and dark rain wrapped around her throat. Kyle stood over the mattress, his chest rising and falling in ragged tears. Firelight cast violent shadows across his scarred cheek. Those golden eyes burned into her skin, completely consumed by a starving focus. Dragging the discarded cloak up to her chin, Lyra shrank into the corner of the bed. She braced for the interrogation. She waited for the pain. Instead, Kale curled his hands into white-knuckled fists. He took one agonizing step backward. Without uttering a single syllable, the savage Alpha turned on his heel and walked out the door. The metal lock slammed shut, sealing the lost air inside the monster's cage. Iron grated against iron. The deadbolt slid home with a sickening thud, echoing off the high stone walls. Cold drafts whistled through the mortar. Dust danced in the faint light of the hearth. Lyra pushed herself up from the black pelts. The mattress absorbed her movement, swallowing her in the scent of crushed cedar and raw rain. Her bare feet hit the floorboards. She checked the metal door, pushed against the damp rock, traced the narrow cracks near the ceiling. A cage was still a cage, no matter how soft the floor. Her pulse hammered against her eardrums. Surviving meant finding teeth. Creeping toward a wide oak desk, she kept her breathing shallow. Worn, blood-stained parchment covered the wood, pinned down by iron daggers. Tracing a finger over the parchment, she found the slave camp. A violent red slash marked the canyon. Beside it sat a second map, detailing a jagged mountain range labeled the Shattered Peak, circled in fresh charcoal. Who hid in the freezing snow? Right next to a curved blade rested a small glass vial. Purple liquid sloshed against the glass, glowing with a sick, humming light. Old nursery rhymes warned of shadow tears, a poison that ripped the shifting magic right out of a wolf's blood. Was the warlord stealing magic? Or was he bleeding out? She backed away from the desk, her spine hitting the rock wall. Rusty hinges shrieked. KL filled the doorway. He stripped off his leather armor, looking entirely drained of his feral rage. In his scarred hands rested a steaming wooden bowl. The rich, salty scent of roasted marrow hit the freezing air. Lyra's empty stomach twisted into a painful knot. He crossed the floorboards, setting the broth onto a nearby stool. Eat. The gravel in his voice vibrated through her toes. Biting her bottom lip, she pressed her shoulders harder into the stone. Taking enemy rations meant owing an enemy debt. Steam curled into the cold room, wrapping around her starved senses and threatening to break her iron will. Steam continued to curl off the hot broth, filling the cavern with the intoxicating smell of roasted meat. The warmth thickened the air, suffocating her defenses. Lyra stared at the food. Saliva flooded her dry mouth. Every instinct screamed to tear into the meal, yet her stubborn pride nailed her back to the wall. KL crossed his arms. His dark leather creaked in the silence. I said, "Eat," he ordered. Speaking meant exposing the tremor in her throat. She ground her teeth together and swallowed the terror. Boot heels struck the floorboards. KL stalked across the room, closing the distance until his shadow swallowed her entirely. The ambient heat rolling off his skin burned like an open furnace. Looking up required bending her neck. His golden irises tracked the dirt smeared across her cheeks. "Who are you?" he asked, dropping his voice into a lethal, quiet rumble. "Why were you hiding in that filth?" She swallowed hard. A predator's breath dusted her collarbone, freezing the blood in her veins. Instead of waiting for an answer, he slammed a scarred fist into the rock right next to her head. The crack of knuckles on stone rang in her ears. Small pebbles showered down onto the floorboards. He leaned closer. His straight nose grazed her tangled hair. "You smell like rain and cedar," he murmured, his chest rumbling against her own. "You smell like me. Why?" A violent shock arced down her spine. His voice cracked with strain. His large hands gripped the stone beside her, the knuckles entirely white. The warlord was cracking. His inner beast warred with the ruthless alpha, demanding he claim the prey he had captured. A fatal slip of empathy pierced her chest. She traced the jagged scar cutting through his eyebrow, seeing the exhaustion buried beneath the violence. Before the urge to touch him overpowered her survival instincts, she ducked under his arm. Snatching the wooden bowl, she shoved a chunk of hot meat into her mouth to gag her own words. Turning back, she caught his gaze. The feral, consuming obsession burning in his eyes promised to burn this entire mountain to ash just to keep her. Dawn brought no relief, only a hateful rebel guard kicking the iron door open and dragging her out into the freezing mist. "Get up, slave," the guard spat, keeping a tight grip on her bruised arm. "Alpha wants the blood washed off you." Stumbling down the treacherous mountain path, Lyra kept her chin tucked. Frost coated the jagged rocks. On either side of the dirt trail, twisted bark pulsed with a sickly purple glow. Black sap bled from the roots, poisoning the soil. Slave camp whispers spoke of these rotting woods. The ash from these cursed branches burrowed into a wolf's lungs, twisting their minds until they ripped their own throats out. Was the rebel army breathing this rot every day? Mud squelched beneath her numb toes. They reached the riverbank. The water rushed violently over sharp stones, churning with white foam. "Wash," the guard barked. Lyra dug her heels into the slush. The river looked deep enough to drown a horse. A rough hand slammed into her spine. Gravity took her. She crashed face first into the shallows. Jagged rocks sliced open her kneecaps. Ice-cold water swallowed her gasp. Water roared in her ears. Her lungs seized. The bitter cold bit down to the bone. Then, the panic ignited. A buzzing heat snapped at the base of her skull. It raced through her frozen veins, replacing the terror with absolute boiling rage. Golden light flared beneath the surface. The river hissed. Bubbles erupted around her legs. The icy current instantly turned to boiling steam. It didn't scorch her skin, but the guard behind her let out a blood-curdling shriek. He scrambled backward onto the mud, clutching bright red, blistered hands. "Witch!" he screamed, spitting dirt. Lyra pushed up onto her knees, gasping for air. The morning mist smelled like burnt sugar. She stared down at the bubbling current. Her reflection stared back. The irises blazing with undeniable, radiant gold. A shadow eclipsed the rising sun. Her head snapped up. Kael stood on the high rock ridge directly above the riverbank. His predatory eyes locked onto her glowing face, tracking the raw magic burning in her veins. The executioner had finally found the lost heir. The brutal incline of the mountain trail tore at her numb feet. Freezing mist from the boiling river clung to Lyra's soaking clothes, turning the thin fabric to ice against her skin. Kael dragged her upward by the wrist, never breaking his relentless stride. Reaching the high cavern, a shadow blocked the entrance. Silas waited by the iron doors, blood dripping from his chin. "She's a witch!" the lieutenant roared, his voice cracking like a whip. "The guard is burned! She used dark magic!" Kael cut off her path. Stepping between them, his dark leather armor formed an impenetrable wall. "Silence," Kael ordered. Silas bared yellow canines, completely ignoring the Alpha command. "She belongs in the fighting pits. The pack demands blood." Lyra dug her dirty fingernails into her palms. The fighting pits meant getting torn apart for sport. Shifting her weight, she mapped the exit behind her, calculating the drop off the jagged cliff edge. She would rather jump than burn. Kael crossed his arms. "She is my prisoner. I will deal with her." A guttural snarl vibrated in Silas's throat. "You are weak. The purple sickness spreads through the trees, and you bring a curse into our home." Lunging forward, Kael grabbed Silas by the throat. He slammed the lieutenant hard into the rock face. Loose gravel cascaded down the wall. Wind whistled through the sudden quiet. "I am the Alpha," Kael growled. Releasing his grip, he grabbed Lyra's shoulder and shoved her violently through the cavern entrance. The metal door slammed shut, trapping her inside the dark room with a ticking bomb. Thunder rattled the metal door, sealing them inside the cavern. A violent storm battered the mountain peak, driving freezing rain through the narrow cracks in the ceiling. Lyra curled onto the dark pelts, shivering violently. Kael paced the floorboards. Leather creaked with every restless step. The air inside the room burned with unsent fuel, suffocating her lungs. He stopped dead. "You have sunfire magic." His voice dropped into a low, lethal vibration. Golden eyes locked directly onto hers. Denial meant absolutely nothing now. Lyra tipped her chin up, refusing to cower like a beaten dog. "I am a lost heir. Are you going to kill me?" Kael closed his eyes. His chest expanded, pulling in the cedar scent between them like a dying man seeking oxygen. A deafening crack split the air. The ceiling buckled. An oak support beam snapped violently in half, raining sharp splinters across the room. Lyra lunged for the floor. She wasn't fast enough. A jagged boulder crashed down, pinning her left leg to the floorboards. White-hot agony erupted in her marrow. A ragged scream tore from her throat. The pain shattered her mental shields, flooding her veins with pure fire. Golden light exploded from her irises, illuminating the dark stone in a blinding wash of magic. Wood dust drifted through the glowing air. The ringing in her ears drowned out the storm. The iron door burst inward. 3 guards stood in the threshold, their wide eyes locked perfectly on her glowing face. Radiant gold spilled across the floorboards, reflecting directly off the silver blades the 3 guards drew from their belts. Rain poured through the broken doorway, soaking the dirt. "Sunfire!" a guard shouted. Lyra braced for the execution. Instead, Kale let out a chest-cracking roar. He lunged backward, becoming a blur of coiled muscle and violence. He slammed into his own men, driving them out into the freezing mud. Grabbing the metal door, he hauled it shut. He shoved a stone table across the floorboards, wedging it firmly against the frame. Rain battered the blocked door. Water dripped from the broken ceiling. Lyra swallowed the metallic taste of blood pooling in her mouth. Kyle dropped to his knees beside her. He wedged his calloused hands under the jagged boulder. Cords of muscle strained against his armor. With a violent grunt, he hurled the rock aside. "Lyra," he rasped. The sound of her name hijacked her pulse. He scooped her off the floorboards, pressing her against his chest. His golden eyes searched her glowing face, completely stripped of their alpha coldness. Pure, unmasked panic bled into his gaze. "You chose me," she whispered, her voice cracking. He pressed his forehead against hers. His breath hit her skin, smelling of crushed cedar and raw fear. "If they find out I am harboring a Sunfire heir, they will burn us both." His thumb tracked a slow line through the dirt on her cheek. Outside, the rebel pack began hammering their fists against the iron door, demanding blood. Blood soaked through the ripped linen. Kael pulled the torn strip of his tunic taut around her splintered shin, anchoring the makeshift splint. Searing pain lanced up Lyra's thigh. Grinding her teeth together, she swallowed the scream rising in her throat, tasting copper instead. Rain hissed against the hot stones of the hearth. Ash drifted across the floorboards. "Why didn't you let them kill me?" she choked out. Tracking the knot in the bandage, Kale froze. His broad shoulders hitched. When he lifted his head, ancient sorrow fractured his golden irises. "A glowing blade killed my pack," he rasped, the words scraping out of his throat. "I was a pup. I crawled beneath the floorboards, and I watched them all bleed out." Wind rattled the barricaded door. Dust tumbled from the stone ceiling. Grief radiated from his scarred frame, suffocating the room. Reaching out, Lyra dragged her trembling fingers across the jagged scar on his cheek. He leaned into her dirty palm. A ragged exhale shuddered through his chest. "My mother possessed the Sunfire curse," Lyra whispered. "She healed a dying rebel pup. Your soldiers slaughtered her anyway." His grip on her knee tightened. "Lyra." The gravel in his voice tore down the final barrier. He crossed the floorboards, pulling her up against his leather armor. His mouth crashed into hers. It was a starving, desperate collision. Calloused fingers tangled violently in her matted hair, tasting of dark rain and total ruin. She anchored her hands to his collar, eagerly kissing the warlord who just became her entire world. Dawn stole the warmth of the fire. The space beside Lyra lay cold, smelling faintly of crushed cedar. Kale had slipped through a narrow crack in the back wall to hunt for medicinal roots, leaving her trapped behind the iron door. Dragging her splinted leg across the dirt, she pressed her eye against a rusted bullet hole in the metal. Mist rolled through the courtyard below. Silas stood atop a wooden crate, holding a torn scrap of her tunic. Faint gold sparks danced across the blood-stained fabric. Behind the lieutenant, a cloaked figure lingered in the shadows. A pale hand slipped from the gray wool, pressing a glass vial into Silas's palm. The container pulsed with a poisonous purple light. Wood creaked under Silas's boots. "Look at this!" he roared, throwing the fabric into the mud. "Our Alpha harbors a Sunfire witch. He protects the disease that murdered our families." Snarls ripped through the gathering crowd. Boots stomped the freezing dirt. "Kale is a traitor!" Silas screamed, drawing a curved blade. "Burn the rot out!" 50 throats tipped back. A deafening howl tore through the mountain mist, vibrating straight through the iron door. They were coming. Lyra scrambled backward, scraping her palms on the stone floor. Dragging her useless leg, she reached the oak desk. Her fingers closed around the hilt of a silver dagger. Metal shrieked. The front barricade buckled inward under the crushing force of a dozen charging wolves. Wood splintered violently. Dust choked the cavern air as the metal frame tore away from the stone wall. Behind her, the hidden rock crevice exploded open. Lyra spun, slashing the silver dagger blindly. "Lyra, stop!" Kyle barked, catching her wrist midair. Fresh crimson coated his jaw. Deep claw marks shredded his dark armor. He had slaughtered his way back to the cage. Silas rallied the camp. Kale gasped, hauling her upward. "We jump, now!" Tossing the dagger, he scooped her against his chest. Lyra clamped her arms around his thick neck, staring over his shoulder as the front door ripped completely off its hinges. Snapping jaws flooded the room. Kale ducked into the escape tunnel, his boots pounding against the slick rock. The frantic snarls of the mutinous pack echoed directly behind his heels. Freezing wind slapped her face. They burst out onto a jagged cliff. Hundreds of feet below, black water churned over sharp rocks, roaring with absolute violence. He skidded to the very edge, kicking loose gravel into the abyss. "Do you trust me?" Kale shouted over the gale, his golden eyes wild with cornered adrenaline. Looking down meant certain death. Looking at him meant survival. "Yes!" she screamed. Silas burst onto the precipice, his fangs bared and dripping with saliva. Kyle launched them into the empty air. Gravity vanished. The wind ripped the breath from her lungs. Lyra buried her face into his neck as they plummeted toward the raging current. Freezing water swallowed them whole. The violent rapids sucked them down into the crushing dark, dragging the Alpha and the air right over the precipice of a towering waterfall. Black water violently expelled them onto a bank of freezing mud. Lyra hit the stones hard. River silt coated her throat. Rolling onto her side, she choked up a lungful of icy water, her spine shuddering against the slush. Fog rolled off the churning rapids, entirely blinding her. Through the rushing roar of the current, a wet exhale scraped against the rocks. Lyra dragged her chin out of the mud. Kale lay half submerged in the shallows. The violent river stripped away his lethal strength, exposing the jagged puncture wounds in his leather armor. Crimson bled freely into the dark water, staining the foam. Survival demanded flight. The cold demanded fire. But watching the warlord bleed out paralyzed her legs. Crawling over the sharp stones, she hooked her freezing fingers under his broad shoulders. Her crushed leg dragged uselessly behind her. She dug her heels into the dirt, hauling his dead weight out of the current and onto the slick riverbank. Water dripped from his dark hair. Pushing the wet strands from his pale forehead, she pressed both palms directly over the torn leather on his stomach. Hot blood instantly coated her fingers. His golden irises fluttered. The predatory fire was completely extinguished, leaving only a dull glaze. "Lyra," he rasped, the sound barely clearing his throat. Cold fingers blindly found her wrist, gripping her skin with failing strength. "Leave me," he breathed, a bloody cough rattling his ribs. "The shadow beasts. Smell the blood." Grinding her teeth together, she shook her head. Tears cut hot tracks through the dirt on her face. He fought an entire army for her. She refused to let him die in the mud. Wrapping her arms under his armpits, she locked her grip. She pulled him away from the rushing water, dragging him backward into the pulsing light of the rotting tree line. Rotting bark scraped against Kyle's armor as Lyra dragged him deeper into the decaying forest. Twisted roots snagged her ruined leg. Above them, thick branches pulsed with a violet glow. Purple sludge dripped from the dead leaves, burning smoking holes directly into the mud. It was the toxic sickness Silas held in the glass vial, washed down from the high peaks to poison the roots of the valley. Her lungs burned. Acidic air coated her throat with the taste of spoiled meat and burnt copper. Spotting a hollowed-out oak trunk, she shoved Cale's limp frame inside the dry cavity. His chin dropped to his chest. His breathing turned into a shallow rattle. Finding medicinal moss meant leaving the only cover they had. She crept back out into the violet fog, keeping her spine pressed against the dying trees. She shoved her magic deep down into her gut, trapping the golden light away so she could hide in the dark. A wet snap echoed through the fog. Lyra froze against the bark. Wind rattled the dead branches. Acidic sap dripped onto the forest floor. Through the thick mist, 2 crimson eyes ignited. A shadow beast stalked into the clearing. Mange exposed gray flesh. Acid dripped from its elongated jaws, hissing as it hit the dirt. The plague had mutated a wild wolf into a walking corpse. Diving silently behind a fallen log, Lyra pressed her face into the damp dirt. The monster stopped. Its ruined nostrils flared, pulling in the iron scent of Cale's fresh blood. A guttural shriek tore from its throat, vibrating through the rotting wood. It pivoted its grotesque head directly toward the hollow oak. Snatching a jagged stone from the mud, Lyra locked her grip around the sharp edges, ready to bleed. Lyra hurled the jagged stone into the fog. It cracked sharply against a dead trunk, sending a shower of purple bark into the slush. The crimson eyes snapped toward the sound. The shadow beast whirled, fixing its starving gaze directly on Lyra's cowering form. Acid sizzled on the damp leaves as it took a stalking step forward. Her splinted leg buckled. She hit the mud hard, sliding backward against the rotting log. From the violet mist, a second set of red eyes ignited. Then a third. Claws tore into the dirt. They formed a tight half-circle, trapping her against the dead wood. A wet, tearing sound dragged her attention away from the fangs. Cale pulled himself out of the hollow oak. He dragged his bleeding stomach across the sharp roots, leaving a dark smear across the wood. His arms gave out. He crashed onto the frozen mud, coughing up a spatter of crimson. "Lyra! Run!" he choked out, his vocal cords tearing. He didn't try to stand again. The ruthless warlord pressed his face into the dirt, entirely stripped of his pride. He surrendered to the fangs to buy her a head start. A feral defiance snapped inside her chest. The pack threw him away. The world threw her away. She refused to let this rotting forest claim the only man who bled for her. Digging her fingernails into the slush, Lyra dragged herself upright. She stood directly between the dying alpha and the starving monsters. The beasts lunged. She dropped every mental shield, opening the floodgates of her soul, and waited for the golden fire to burn the forest to ash. Lyra tipped her head back. A primal, tearing sound ripped from her throat, echoing off the rotting bark. Driving her bare hands deep into the freezing slush, she pushed the agony of her splinted leg down into the dirt. A spark ignited in her marrow. It didn't stay a spark. Golden fire erupted from her sternum, expanding in a blinding, violently hot shockwave. The sheer force of the blast cracked the dying trees. Violet shadows instantly disintegrated into white smoke. The 3 shadow beasts didn't even get a chance to shriek. Golden light slammed into their decaying bodies. It didn't burn their flesh. Instead, the magic ripped the sickness straight out of their blood, turning rotting muscle and bone into a pile of fine, gray ash. Wind whipped the ash across the clearing. The sickening stench of copper and decay vanished entirely. Lyra stayed on her knees, staring at her glowing hands. The forest air smelled intensely of spun sugar and ozone. Turning her head, she tracked the retreating wave of light as it rushed toward the hollow oak. The golden magic pooled around Cale's bleeding torso, sinking directly into his torn skin. She crawled toward him, her crushed leg dragging a trench in the mud. The jagged puncture wounds on his chest began to stitch shut. Torn muscle fused together. Pale skin flushed with a sudden rushing heat. The raw scent of dark cedar overpowered the smell of ozone. The blinding light finally retreated back under her skin, leaving the clearing in dark, damp mist. Pushing herself up onto her good leg, Lyra refused to cower in the dirt anymore. She stood completely straight, locking her glowing irises on the tree line, daring the rotting forest to challenge her again. Mist settled over the damp clearing, completely obscuring the gray ash of the dead beasts. Cale shoved his hands into the dirt, pushing his broad frame upward. He looked down at his chest. Smooth, unblemished skin replaced torn leather and fatal wounds. His lungs expanded, pulling in deep, rattling breaths. Slowly, he lifted his head. His predatory irises locked onto Lyra. Bracing her weight against a rotting log, she waited for the warlord to draw a weapon. The Sunfire curse burned in her veins, the very magic that slaughtered his pack. Instead, Kyle crossed the muddy clearing. Without uttering a single syllable, he dropped to his knees directly into the freezing slush at her feet. Calloused fingers reached out, wrapping firmly around her dirty, trembling hand. He bowed his head, pressing his lips directly against her scraped knuckles. "You are magnificent," he rasped, the gravel in his voice vibrating against her skin. The absolute devotion in his tone hijacked her pulse. Tears cut fresh tracks through the dirt on her face. "We have to go back," Lyra said, wiping her cheek with her free hand. "Silas controls the camp, and someone in a gray cloak is supplying the violet sickness." Kael stood up. A lethal, calculating coldness settled over his scarred face. "We take the mountain back," he growled. Crouching down, he dug his fingers into the pile of gray ash left by the beasts. He stood and dragged his ash-coated thumb fiercely across his own cheekbone. Stepping closer, he caught her chin. With a shockingly careful touch, he swiped 2 dark lines of ash across her cheek. The friction of his thumb ignited a violent spark in her chest. She stared up into his golden eyes, completely tethered to the warlord, ready to paint the canyon with rebel blood. The jagged canyon wall tore at Lyra's bleeding fingertips. She gripped the freezing stone, hauling her body upward. The war paint on her cheek cracked as the bitter wind whipped across the sheer cliff face. Climbing no longer felt like a desperate escape. She moved in tandem with Kale, mirroring his silent, lethal precision in the dark. Above them, Silas's loyalists guarded the rocky ascent. They buried silver bear traps beneath the loose gravel, banking on Kale bleeding out in the dark. The mutinous wolves entirely underestimated the Sunfire curse. Kale reached down from a high ledge, locking his hand around Lyra's forearm. He hauled her over the sharp lip of the rock. As her boots hit the dirt, the golden magic simmered under her skin. She tracked a faint, unnatural coldness in the soil. Crouching low, she pressed her palm to the gravel. Heat flared from her fingertips. Beneath the dirt, a hidden silver trap hissed, melting into a harmless puddle of liquid metal. They cleared the path, step by silent step. Shouting voices echoed from the courtyard ahead. Firelight flickered violently against the canyon walls. Kyle gripped her waist, yanking her sideways into the shadow of a towering boulder. He pressed her back flat against his chest, completely shielding her from the firelight. "Silas is addressing the pack," Kale murmured. His lips brushed the shell of her ear. A raw, electric shock zipped down her spine, pooling hot and fast in her gut. She dug her fingernails into his forearms, anchoring herself to his solid muscle. Tipping their heads around the rock, they stared into the camp. Silas stood arrogantly beside the main fire pit. He held Kale's curved blade high above his head, roaring a victory speech to the gathered rebels. The lieutenant thought he owned the mountain. He had absolutely no idea the true alpha and his lethal queen were standing 10 feet away, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Gravel crunched beneath steel-toed boots as Kale shattered the perimeter shadows, walking directly into the blistering heat of the main fire pit. He didn't skulk along the edges. He claimed the mud. Lyra matched his relentless stride, stepping out of the dark to stand flush against his armored side. Firelight cast violent shadows across Silas's pale face. The lieutenant dropped his stolen blade, his mouth hanging completely open. "You!" Silas choked out, retreating a step. "You fell into the black water." A chest-cracking roar tore from Cale's throat. He launched himself forward. Becoming a blur of dark leather and coiled muscle, Cale slammed directly into the usurper. The impact cracked like a rifle shot. 5 loyalist wolves drew iron swords, rushing the Alpha's blind spot. Heat pooled fast in Lyra's gut. Pushing her palms forward, a blinding wave of golden light erupted from her skin. The magic bypassed flesh entirely, latching onto the cold metal. Iron hissed. The swords liquefied instantly, dripping like hot wax into the dirt. The loyalists scrambled backward, clutching blistered palms. In the center of the ring, the warlord moved with lethal precision. Cale ducked a desperate swing, driving a knee into Silas's ribs. Bones snapped. Grasping the traitor by the throat, Cale hauled him off the dirt. Silas kicked his legs wildly, gasping for oxygen. "You betrayed the pack," Cale commanded, his voice cutting through the crackling fire. "And you poisoned my mountain." He didn't wait for a plea. Cale slammed the lieutenant backward into the bedrock. Dust plumed into the air. Ash drifted over the unconscious body. Turning slowly, the warlord faced his silent army. Ash settled over the bleeding usurper, suffocating the courtyard in absolute quiet. The remaining rebels stared at the dirt, their yellow irises darting nervously between the warlord and the glowing woman standing in the mud. Movement flickered near the tree line. A gray cloak dragged across the damp ferns. The cloaked spy sprinted toward the cover of the dying forest. Lyra threw her arm outward. Golden light snapped like a whip, curling violently around the stranger's ankles. She yanked her fist backward. The figure crashed face first into the slush. The wool hood tore away. Gasps rippled through the courtyard. The spy was an ancient elder, his scarred face twisted in pure hatred. He hoarded the purple rot to destroy the bloodline and steal the territory. Cale ignored the crawling traitor. He crossed the firelit ring, stopping directly in front of Lyra. He extended a blood-stained palm. Closing the distance, she pressed her dirty fingers directly against his calloused skin. "She is Lyra," Cale announced, his voice carrying the finality of an execution block. "She is the Sunfire heir. She is my mate." The ozone scent of her magic tangled with his raw cedar. "She healed my blood," Cale growled. "She will heal the soil. Anyone who challenges the queen answers to my teeth." Leather creaked in the silence. One by one, 50 ruthless warriors dropped to their knees in the mud. They flattened their chests against the wet dirt, exposing their jugulars in total submission. Lyra stared down at the surrendered executioners, her pulse hammering wildly in her throat, realizing the cage was finally broken. Weeks of golden magic soaked deep into the mountain bedrock, pulling green shoots from the poisoned earth. Lyra stood on the exact precipice where she had hurled herself into the Black River. The acidic rot was entirely gone. Crisp mountain air rushed up the canyon wall, smelling of crushed cedar and fresh rain. Boot heels struck the stone behind her. Thick arms banded around her waist. Kyle hauled her backward, pressing her spine flush against his chest armor. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, dragging in a ragged, greedy breath of her scent. "My queen," he rasped against her pulse point. A violent spike of heat coiled in her lower belly. Leaning her skull against his shoulder, she watched the sun bleed orange across their reclaimed territory. The endless war was over. "We did it," Lyra murmured, tracing the scarred knuckles wrapped around her ribs. "The valley is united." Kyle turned her within his grip. His golden eyes were utterly clear, stripped of the ancient ghosts that had haunted the cavern. He tracked the lingering gold in her irises, completely obsessed with the fire that saved him. Rough thumbs tilted her chin upward. "You are my entire world, Lyra." He dragged her upward, crashing his mouth onto hers. The collision was entirely starving, a ruthless, bruising kiss that claimed every inch of her breath. She tangled her fingers into his dark hair, eagerly kissing the monster back while the loyal pack below howled at the setting sun.